Welcome to Video Game Genres, where your host Gexup provides you information you need to know about a certain number of video games put in a category. And tonight's episode of Video Game Genre is Survival Horror. Before watching this video, please watch part 1 because it's very important to understand the purpose of this video. So without further ado, let's finish this episode. Survival horror has come a long way, and it's amazing how the genre keeps evolving and trying to make scares bigger and gameplay more exciting. As I said in my last video, the people I interviewed who said they don't like classic survival horror games because of their hatred of the controls. As I said before, many survival horror games turn left and right and press up to make the character to move into the direction. I can see why they don't like the controls because it's not fast paced and it's sometimes frustrating every time you get to a different camera angle. But not all survival horrors have that controls, with underrated classics like Eternal Darkness, where the player moves the character into the direction the player tells it to. But unfortunately, it was a commercial failure, and we would have to look for another survival horror that would transform the genre. During the days of GameCube, PS2, and Xbox era, Capcom decided that's enough with spin-offs and remakes for the GameCube and continued the series. In Tokyo Game Show 2002 and E3 03, Capcom has released gameplay footages of Resident Evil 4. What you're looking at here is the original version of Resident Evil 4, as it plays like classic survival horror with a moving camera of Silent Hill, and they weren't pre-rendered background. They were all in 3D. Since then, no other gameplay footage of the original RE4 was shown because Capcom addressed the complaints about the controls, and director Shinji Mikami decided to change the Resident Evil series completely. Then in early 2005, Resident Evil 4 was released in America for the GameCube, and later on the PS2 and the Wii, and it is what many considered the game that redefined survival horror. Resident Evil 4 is a wide open perspective, and after 7 years of static fixed camera angles, players can now see what Leon sees. Even though your character still stands still while using a weapon, aiming and shooting became very improved as your enemies are faster and they can use weapons that they wield. It also has quick time events, traps, a bigger but as well a limited inventory system, and items, weapons, and weapons upgrade to buy from the merchant who's always one step ahead of you, while still managing to keep the elements from the traditional survival horrors like puzzle solving, spinning around left and right, finding items, reading notes, encountering the unknown, and everything else that makes a survival horror. To this day, Resident Evil 4 is the most successful survival horror game. Its impact forever changed survival horror from a fixed camera angle adventure into a third-person shooter. Later on, old survival horror series evolved with Resident Evil 4, with Silent Hill Homecoming, Alone in the Dark, Fatal Frame 4, and Siren Blood Curse. And new series like The Suffering, Deadly Premonition, Dead Space, and more that plays more or less like RE4. Back on horror games in general, the adventure genre has lost popularity, but as the gaming industry continues to change, first-person shooters are far from over, with creating new horrors that survival horror cannot pull off, like the most underrated System Shock 2, Doom 3, Fear, Condemned 1 and 2, the unforgettable BioShock, Left 4 Dead, and so much more. New horror games are expanding to the gaming industry with new style of gameplay. However, there are old school survival horror fans that doesn't feel right with the changes being made with the horror genre. As an open-minded person, I ask why they prefer old horror games over the new ones. Many did complain since the genre focused on fixing controls, the genre focused more on action than they did with making the audience scared. Many old fans accused Resident Evil 4 of something that it wasn't, having less puzzles, high-level stock of ammunition, and more hardcore action, feeling lost that many survival horror series has changed. There are many that had scary moments with RE4, but there are others that didn't. I hate to admit this, but I loved RE4 mainly because of the action and the killing so many enemies, but for the scares, I was pretty underwhelmed compared to the past Resident Evil games. In fact, these changes that other horror series has made really did change a lot than what they used to be, and it divided fans in liking it or disliking it. Since this change was made, many gamers complained and debated whether or not games are scary. Some may argue what's scary and what isn't, so I'm here to give you my perspective of what makes a game scary, which is the most important thing when anyone talks about survival horror games. What separates playing a horror game than watching a horror movie is that since the player controls the character, they attach to the character and react to whatever happens to him or her. Since we as gamers play all these characters and keep them to survive and accomplish a goal, like in almost every video game, but games are scary when they reflect and emphasize on common fears that we as humans have, and those fears categorized in one category: the unknown. The most unpredictable games are usually the ones that gets the player most excited. But when it comes to threatening situations, feeling weak, or when we don't know what's going to happen, then that's when we become scared. It's like getting into a new school. How much is this going to hurt? What's going to happen to me? It creates a nervousness to an individual. For others, when they have a phobia, whenever they see something uncomfortable, they tend to immediately react, witnessing that phobia. Like most people have chlorophobia, they are incredibly intimidated with clowns, but for some, love them for their amusement, or hated it because of being annoyed. So basically what I'm saying is that whatever you find scary, or in any other mood, others may not feel the same as you do. Like they say, opinions are like assholes, everyone has one. Even if I didn't mention your favorite horror game in either part 1 or 2, and talk more about the ones that you're not interested in, is because I'm focusing on the games that define survival horror genre. Even if I focus on Resident Evil too much, I'm not forcing you to be scared of the stuff that I'm scared of. To be honest, some of these games that are in this video are not scary to me personally, but I have to heavily discuss them because they are the reasons why we have all this stuff today. Most of all, they did scare a lot of people for their time. I mean, where would we be if we didn't have games like Alone in the Dark? Is RE and every other horror game going to be different than what it is today? I mean, this is what this video series is about. But back on the topic of scares. We can't logically explain why we react to the stuff that we fear, but the reason why we fear these certain things is because we fear it to protect our personal safety, our own lives, our own loved ones, or even if there's a heaven or hell waiting for us. Since I already discussed about players attached to playable characters, it makes a great combination for fright. That's the reason why there's so many horror games that uses unearthly creatures like zombies, monsters, demons, aliens, and more that's beyond expectations. All you know is that they mean you harm and they cause an enigma. These monsters are heavily part of the environment itself. The main thing to even make a game to be categorized as a horror genre is its atmosphere. Even if you don't find a certain game scary, at least its atmosphere gets you intimidated and focus on everything surrounding the character, like unfamiliar corners, what's behind the door, sounds and noises that you can't identify, or can't explain what or why it's here, is all combined to fear probable in all good horror games. Well, my theory of being scared in video games focuses on design. Another theory among players is game mechanics. The logic is, the character should not be overpowered, otherwise the player has nothing to worry about when an enemy is so easy to kill, which will dispel the atmosphere. I did say mediocre controls in classic survival horrors, with terrorists trying to kill you, is the hallmark of the genre. Many people I know that says games intended to be scary weren't because the character is too powerful or too capable for any legitimate scares. It's true because scary moments in non-horror games like Fallout 3, whenever I see a Deathclaw, I get nervous because they kill faster than any creature in the wasteland, but yet, having a fat man to nuke will obliterate them and you have nothing else to worry about. Even in scary movies, when the main character runs away from something or someone trying to kill him or her, it gets the audience to feel the intensity and to care for the main character to survive and rid the antagonist. So my point is, we're more of the predators rather than the prey. But at the same time, it's kinda wrong because having good controls in a horror game can still be scary when enemies and design can still surprise you at the most unexpected moments, just as long as the character isn't too capable for legitimate scares. Take for example Eternal Darkness. Many will say the game is not scary because the enemies aren't scary, the graphics are outdated. Well, it's more than meets the eye. You have to keep playing the game until the game mindfucks you with the sanity effects, which is the major strength with games like Eternal Darkness for it to be even scary. I never want to show any bias with the video game genre series, but in expressing my opinion about monsters needing to be scary should not always be the scariest part in horror games, because let's face it, games like Resident Evil has too many repetitive zombies and mutants that it was terrifying to encounter for its time, but it gets outdated. The original Doom used to terrify people, but now it's no longer scary, but yet, it's still fun to play. That's the reason why Capcom released the remakes to reintroduce the monsters in better graphics in order to really scare gamers. But for games like Silent Hill, didn't heavily focus on making the monsters disturbing or having the best graphics to be at all scary, even though they did. They made it a narrative stories, making so many unanswered questions and confusing moments that made the players psychological when playing it. That's why many people say Silent Hill is scarier than Resident Evil. You can say getting older is the reason why some games used to be scary but not anymore, which is the reason why many games age fast for some people. Developers should really focus on how to make the game scary, now and future, in order to stand the test of time to make the game forever scary. It is possible for a game to be truly scary with good controls, as well as not spiting the mechanics. The focus on making you really scared give you the big shockers in games like BioShock, and System Shock 2, which still lives up to its reputation of being scary today. So whatever is a jump scare, plot twist, confusing uncomfortable moments, and more, surprises should be the strength of any horror media. If it's the same repetitive monsters you'll find area to area, it's like hearing the same joke over and over again. It gets old and repetitive. But at the same time, try not to make the scares too memorable because we'll be expecting it the next time we play that horror game, which may or may not surprise you if you already know it. I worry about these things because horror games are kind of sinking in the same hole like horror movies. They ran out of ideas of scares and they're oversaturating the genre with over-the-top violence. So whatever you find scary, I'm sure that you'll find them in video games. I know what it's like to be scared, and believe me, it's only fun to be scared when it's not real. But enjoy the ride while it's still exciting. Yet, not all scares are offered in horror games, but also in non-horror games that has its own scary moments. Who can ever forget the bottom of the well, or Inside the King's Grave in Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, or Psycho Mantis' mind tricks in Metal Gear Solid? Scares in games are an excellent combination for a thrilling experience. Scares in games should not be looked on how disturbing or how realistic the enemies are, but rather how much the game can scare you. Even though there are new games of old series like Resident Evil 5 and Silent Hill Homecoming that ran out of gas and no longer has to offer the fright that they once had, and new ones like Alan Wake and Left 4 Dead that never was scary or psychological to begin with, but it was fun to shoot at enemies in my humble opinion. Also, I hate the term games aren't scary anymore because those are the people who are still looking at the same old series that doesn't have it anymore and never seem to look hard enough for really frightening games like the Penumbra series, Ju-On the Grudge, a great haunted house simulator, and a new game that just came out recently called Amnesia: The Dark Descent, a great spiritual successor of Eternal Darkness, which is not only the scariest game I've played in a long time, but my nomination for Game of the Year 2010. It's games like these that deserve more attention than the mainstream games that dares to call themselves horror games. Because I can tell you one thing, scares in video games are far from over. Horror in video games has come a long way, from text-based games to point-and-click adventures to fixed camera angles to shooters. So what's going to happen to survival horror? We really don't know. But one thing for sure, they came a long way, and I'm more than anticipated to see another horror game to redefine the genre. Even if we don't have the same fears, there's always one scary moment in a game that continues to haunt you, even if you turn the gaming system off. So that wraps up this episode of Video Game Genres. If you like what you just saw, give a thumbs up, post a comment in telling us what is your favorite horror game, and if you haven't already, please subscribe.